The air in the room was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that pressed against everyone gathered at the altar. The guests sat in stunned silence, their eyes shifting between the bride, the groom, and the figure standing at the back of the room. The priest, who had just begun to speak the sacred vows, faltered as a soft whisper escaped the bride's lips. Her eyes were filled with regret, but the words that left her mouth could not be taken back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a breath against the stillness. The groom's face tightened, his grip on the railing becoming painful to witness. His heart pounded in his chest as his world, the life he thought he'd built, began to unravel. "What?" he said, his voice hoarse with shock and rising anger. The guests, frozen in their seats, waited for something to happen, but all that could be heard was the sound of her trembling hands reaching for the stranger behind her, pulling away from the man she had once promised herself to. The room remained frozen in a state of disbelief, as if the very air had thickened with uncertainty. The bride's whispered confession echoed in the minds of everyone who heard it. The groom, who had been sure of his bride's love and loyalty, now stood on the edge of something he couldn't understand. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "What do you mean?" he asked, his gaze cutting to the stranger. His body trembled, not with fear, but with something darker. His hand still gripped the railing, knuckles aching, but it was the pain in his chest that was unbearable. The stranger, standing like a phantom in the shadows, took a step forward. His presence was enough to break the fragile calm, and everyone held their breath. The priest, now as still as the rest, cleared his throat, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Shall we proceed?" But the question hung in the air, unanswered. The bride's face was pale, guilt and fear etched into every line, as she turned her back to the man she had promised forever. The silence was deafening, but there was a growing sense of inevitability. The bride slowly turned her back on the groom, her posture rigid. She knew that whatever happened next, the man standing behind her was no longer a stranger. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear, it was something far deeper. A twisted sense of guilt, sorrow, and longing for something she couldn't explain. She felt trapped, as if bound by invisible chains. The groom's eyes followed her every move, his heart torn. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was watch as she took a final step away from him, each moment like a strike to his soul. You don't have to do this," he finally whispered, though the words felt empty, hollow. The bride's gaze lingered for a heartbeat before she stepped closer to the stranger, her hand reaching for his as if it were a lifeline. The groom's voice cracked as he stepped forward, a man broken. "Why?" he asked, his voice filled with the rawness of betrayal. His hand shook as he reached out toward her, but the distance between them felt infinite. The guests sat frozen, unsure whether they should intervene or allow the spectacle to unfold. The bride stood still for a moment, her back to him, but the silence spoke volumes. "I've always known," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not who you think I am." The words hit the groom like a blow. His legs buckled slightly, but he remained standing, his eyes wide, searching her face for any sign of truth. But the truth was something he couldn't understand, something that had been hidden in the darkness until now. The stranger behind her stepped forward, his shadow falling over the bride, his presence unsettling. The silence was broken only by the groom's ragged breath, each inhale sharp, filled with the weight of everything unraveling before him. His heart raced, not just with the fury of betrayal, but with something darker, the fear of losing her forever. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But the bride didn't look back. Her hand, still grasping the stranger's, trembled slightly, as though her body was betraying her. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never did." The words echoed in the groom's mind, repeating endlessly, each one a dagger to his heart. His knees buckled, but his pride kept him standing. He would not fall before her, not like this. The room seemed to grow colder, as if the very air knew something had shifted, something had broken beyond repair. The days after the wedding had passed in a blur, but the weight of betrayal still clung to the groom. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the same moments, the bride's whispered confession, the distant look in her eyes, the stranger's looming presence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her pulling away from him, and every time he woke, his heart felt heavy with unanswered questions. He spent the nights pacing, his thoughts racing. The mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. Alone in the study, he turned over the pages of the wedding album, his fingers tracing the images. Each photograph was a reminder of something that was now lost. His reflection in the glass caught his eye, and he realized he no longer recognized the man staring back at him. "Who am I without her?" he whispered to the empty room, the question echoing like a prayer that went unanswered. The door creaked open, and a familiar presence filled the doorway. It was the stranger. The man who had come between them, who had turned the world upside down. The groom's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice cold and steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him. The stranger remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. There was no hint of apology in his eyes, no remorse. Instead, there was a quiet certainty. He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. "I'm not here to fight you," the stranger said finally, his voice smooth and calm. "I came to explain." The words sent a shock through the groom, and for a split second, he hesitated. His fist clenched, but he said nothing. "Explain?" The groom spat, his patience thin. "What's there to explain?" The stranger's eyes softened, but his resolve was clear. The stranger walked further into the room, his presence filling every corner. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "What you saw that day, what she said, it wasn't meant for you." The words hit the groom like a slap, but he didn't react, his expression unreadable. "Then why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she warn me?" he asked, the pain in his voice barely concealed. The stranger's eyes darkened. "She couldn't. She never could. You weren't meant to find out." The tension between them thickened, each word stoking the fire of resentment in the groom's chest. "Who are you?" the groom finally asked, his voice hoarse with the weight of his emotions. The stranger's gaze softened for a moment before he replied, "I'm the reason she can't be with you." The truth hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and impenetrable. "All this time, you've been lying?" The groom's voice cracked, his words laced with disbelief. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, his movements sharp and angry. "She chose you over me. After everything we shared, after all I did for her, she chose you." The stranger's gaze remained steady, unmoving. "She never had a choice," he said softly, his words holding the weight of a secret too dark to reveal. "She was always bound to me, in ways you'll never understand." The groom recoiled, his hands shaking. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. The stranger's face softened, and for a brief moment, there was an emotion in his eyes, pity. "I didn't want this for you," he said. "But I've been trying to protect you. She is not who you think she is." The air between them crackled with tension, the unknown hanging like a curtain over their heads. The words hung between them, heavy with the implications of everything that had been said. The groom took a step back, his mind reeling. "Who is she then? What have you done to her?" His voice was sharp, his fists clenching as he fought to keep his composure. The stranger's eyes met his, and for the first time there was a flicker of something, regret maybe. "She's not free, and neither are you." The statement was simple, but it cut deeper than anything the groom had heard so far. "She's trapped," the stranger continued, "and I'm the only one who can help her." The words burned in the groom's chest, igniting a fire of anger and helplessness. "You'll never have her," he said, his voice low but fierce. The stranger's expression softened slightly, and he took a deep breath. "I never wanted to take her from you, but I've always been here and I always will be. You need to accept that." The words echoed in the groom's mind, a haunting reminder of the life he'd lost. The weight of the stranger's words still clung to the groom's mind like a suffocating fog. No matter how many times he tried to shake them, they remained, twisting and contorting his perception of everything he thought he knew. The truth, if it could be called that, felt more like a nightmare unfolding. The bride, the woman he had once trusted with his heart, was no longer the person he had believed her to be. The stranger had planted a seed of doubt that grew with every passing moment, threatening to consume him. He couldn't understand how she could have been living a lie for so long. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the realization that his entire life had been built on something false. He stood in the empty hallway of his mansion, staring at the door to the bride's room. He had not seen her since the wedding, and though his heart ached for her, the anger inside him burned hotter than any love he had once felt. His hand reached for the door handle, but he hesitated. What would he find on the other side? Could he face her knowing what he now did? When the door finally opened, the sight that greeted him was not the woman he expected. The bride stood there, her back to him, looking out the window as the light from the setting sun bathed her in a warm, golden glow. For a moment, she seemed like a stranger, distant, untouchable. But when she turned to face him, her eyes held the same sorrow that had haunted him for days. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but there was no escape from the truth she had been keeping. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The groom's heart tightened as the words sank in. He had spent so many nights wishing he could understand, could have an answer. But now that the moment was here, he found himself lost in the sea of emotion swirling inside him. "I need you to explain," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why?" The bride looked away, her eyes clouded with guilt. "Because if I tell you, I'll lose you forever." He stepped closer, the urge to reach out to her overwhelming, but he held back. The distance between them felt like an insurmountable chasm. "I need the truth," he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "What have you been hiding?" The bride turned slowly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she stepped toward him, her hands trembling as they reached for his. He recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. The pain of seeing her so close yet so far away was unbearable. "You don't get to keep me at arm's length," he said, his voice tight with anger and hurt. "You either tell me everything, or you lose me. I won't stay in this web of lies any longer." The bride's breath hitched as she lowered her gaze to the floor. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But I was trapped. And so were you." The silence between them grew unbearable, each passing second stretching into eternity. Finally, the bride spoke, her voice breaking. "You don't understand," she said, stepping back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You never could. I wasn't just running from you. I was running from myself." The groom stood still, his gaze never leaving her face as her words sank in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The bride's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, the words heavy with a truth he hadn't expected. "I didn't choose this life. It was chosen for me." The groom's chest tightened as he fought to keep his composure. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice sharp, filled with a mix of confusion and pain. The bride took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. "There's so much you don't know. So much that I can never tell you." "I don't care what secrets you're hiding," the groom said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't get to keep me in the dark anymore." His anger flared, and for the first time, he didn't try to control it. The fear, the betrayal, the hurt, it all poured out, raw and jagged. The bride flinched at the sharpness of his words, but she didn't move. "You don't understand," she whispered again, shaking her head. "This isn't just about you and me." The groom's patience snapped. "Then what is it about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What the hell are you hiding from me?" The bride's gaze met his for the first time, and her eyes were filled with an unbearable sadness. "I've always loved you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I was never the one you thought I was." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. and for the first time, the groom felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. The air was thick with the silence of a truth too heavy to bear. The groom stood at the edge of the room, every muscle in his body tense as the weight of the bride's words settled in his chest. She had always been the one person who could make him feel whole, and yet now she stood before him as a stranger, her identity fragmented by secrets he couldn't begin to understand. "You were never mine," the bride said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I never had the choice you think I did." The words tore through him, each one sinking deeper into his soul. He clenched his fists, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but the words felt stuck in his throat. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in as though they were a reflection of his own emotional confinement. "Then who am I to you?" he asked, his voice rough, as he took a step toward her. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" The bride took a hesitant step forward, her hand outstretched as if to bridge the distance between them. "You've always had a place in my heart," she said, her voice trembling. "But I've been living a life that's not mine. I was forced into it from the beginning." The groom's heart clenched painfully at her words. "Forced into it? By who?" he demanded, his patience running thin. The bride's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "I couldn't tell you, not then, and not now," she whispered. "You wouldn't have understood." The silence that followed was deafening. The groom stepped closer, his voice now cold. "Then tell me now," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm done living in this lie. If we're going to have any chance, it starts with the truth." The bride hesitated, then nodded, a single tear escaping her eye. "It's not just about us," she murmured almost too softly to hear. The groom felt his heart race as he heard the bride's words. "It's not just about us." The words echoed in his mind, pushing away the remnants of his hope. He took another step forward, his desperation growing. "Then what is it about?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. The bride turned back to him, her eyes filled with sorrow and fear. "There's a greater force at play here," she said, her voice low. "It's not just us caught in this mess. There are others involved. People who control everything we do, everything we say." The groom's brows furrowed in confusion. "Who?" he asked, stepping closer still. "Who's controlling us?" The bride's voice trembled as she spoke again. "I was never meant to be with you. Not the way you think. My life, my choices, they were all decided long before you and I ever met." The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable another weight added to the burden on his shoulders. The groom's hands clenched into fists as he tried to process her words. "So you were always a pawn? A piece in someone else's game?" The bitterness in his voice cut through the quiet room like a blade. The bride didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, her back to him. "Not a pawn," she said softly, "but a player in a game I didn't choose to play." The groom's chest tightened as the anger surged within him. "Then why didn't you fight it? Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. The bride's shoulders slumped as she turned back to face him. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I couldn't protect myself, let alone you. I thought I could bury it all, bury the truth, but it's too late now." The words hung between them, like a confession that neither could ignore. The groom took a step back, the hurt on his face clear. "You should have told me," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The room was suffocating. The truth was like a heavy, unseen weight pressing down on them both. The groom felt the anger slowly dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of loss. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice hoarse, filled with a mixture of pain and finality. The bride's face twisted in sorrow as she slowly crossed the room toward him. "I don't expect you to," she whispered. "I only wish you could understand why I did it, why I couldn't tell you everything." The groom's gaze dropped to the floor, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had loved her with everything he had, but now, that love felt like a distant memory. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again," he admitted, his voice shaking. The bride's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her regrets. "I never wanted to hurt you," she cried. "But I was already broken before you ever came into my life." The quiet after the storm was suffocating. The groom paced the length of the room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Every step he took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness of the mansion, each footfall a reminder of how far he had fallen. The bride stood by the window, her body facing the darkening world outside, her back to him. The tension in the air was thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to break the silence. He couldn't look at her anymore, not without feeling the weight of the secrets she had kept from him. "How can I trust you now?" he finally asked, his voice low and cracked with emotion. The bride's shoulders tensed, and she slowly turned to face him, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I never wanted to lie to you," she whispered. "But I didn't know how to tell you the truth without losing you." His chest tightened at the sincerity in her voice, but it wasn't enough to erase the anger that still burned in him. "You should have trusted me," he replied bitterly. "You should have trusted us." The bride's voice quivered as she spoke again, her words a desperate attempt to reach him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt anyone." The groom's gaze softened for a moment, but the anger quickly resurfaced. "Then why did you let it go on for so long?" he demanded. "Why didn't you stop it?" She stepped toward him, her eyes pleading. "Because I was trapped," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't have a choice. I thought if I kept going I could protect you, protect both of us. But I was wrong." The groom's heart wrenched at her words, but the anger still lingered, eating at him from the inside. "You should have told me. You should have trusted me enough to share the burden with me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The bride's face crumpled, and she took a step back, the weight of her own guilt weighing heavily on her. The room seemed to close in on them, the air heavy with unspoken words. The bride's tears fell freely now, each drop a silent plea for forgiveness. "I never meant to push you away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But the more I kept from you, the more I felt like I was losing you." The groom stood frozen, his heart torn between the woman he had once loved and the stranger who now stood before him. "And yet, here we are," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've pushed me so far away, I don't know how to find my way back to you." The bride's breath caught in her throat as she took another step toward him, her eyes searching his face for some sign that there was still a chance. "I don't know if we can go back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I need you to know that I still love you, even after everything." The words hit the groom like a thunderclap, and for the first time in days, he let himself feel the weight of her confession. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held the weight of everything they had said, everything they had felt. The groom took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pull of the woman he had loved, the woman who had broken his heart, but still, a part of him wanted to reach for her. He stopped just short of her, his breath steadying as he stared down at her tear-streaked face. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "But maybe, just maybe, we can start again. Maybe we can figure out what this is between us." The bride's eyes filled with hope, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give," she whispered. "I don't need you to forgive me right now. I just need you to believe that I never stopped loving you." The room seemed to hold its breath as they stood there, two people fractured by the past, unsure of what the future held, but willing to try. The bride let out a shaky breath as the distance between them continued to close. "Maybe we can't erase what's happened," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But we can rebuild. We can make something new." The groom's heart pounded in his chest as he finally took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers. "I don't know if I can ever forget," he said quietly. "But I'll try. For us, for what we could still have." His words were filled with uncertainty, but they were also filled with a flicker of hope. The bride's tears began to slow, but the sadness in her eyes remained, though now there was something else there too, an echo of hope, of possibility. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We'll rebuild, one piece at a time." The groom nodded, his grip tightening on her hand as he took a deep breath. The future was still unclear, but for the first time in days, he felt as if there was a way forward. Days had passed since their last conversation, and though there was still a palpable tension between them, something had shifted. The air in the mansion felt different now, charged, yet somehow quieter. The bride, who had once been a stranger, was slowly becoming the woman the groom had once loved, but the wounds they both carried had left deep scars. The groom found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The world outside was dark, the rain tapping gently against the glass. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might be able to face it. The door creaked open, and the bride stepped into the room. Her face was softer now, but there was still a wariness in her eyes. She approached him slowly, hesitating as if she feared pushing him too far. "I know things aren't fixed yet," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "But I need you to know I'm here, for whatever comes next." The groom didn't turn to face her, but he nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. The bride took a tentative step forward, her hands wringing together as she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About the lies, about the choices I made." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to tear us apart. But I see now that I did." The groom's heart clenched, but he didn't respond. His mind raced, torn between the hurt and the small flicker of hope that still burned inside him. She stepped closer, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve it," she whispered. "But I want to try, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative, like the first steps towards something new. The groom finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," he said quietly, "but I'll give you the chance to show me." The next few days were filled with awkward silences and fragile attempts at communication. There were moments when the old connection between them felt as though it might resurface, and other moments when it seemed impossible to bridge the emotional chasm. But they tried, both of them. The groom found himself letting down his guard little by little, allowing her to see the cracks in his armor. They spent time together in silence, sharing meals, walking through the grounds of the mansion, their hands brushing briefly in passing. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, the bride finally spoke again, her voice soft and hesitant. "Do you think we can ever be the way we were?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what had come before. The groom looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But maybe we don't need to be. Maybe we just need to figure out who we are now." Weeks passed, and the fragile new version of their relationship began to take shape. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the past threatened to overwhelm them, when the weight of the secrets and lies they had shared threatened to pull them under. But they kept moving forward, step by step, building something stronger out of the remnants of what had once been. One evening, as they stood in the garden, the groom turned to the bride, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice steady, "about not needing to go back to what we were." The bride looked at him, her heart in her throat. "And?" she asked, barely able to breathe. "I think you're right," he said softly. "We can't go back, but we can start over. And that's something, isn't it?" The bride's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were different. Tears of hope, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's something." The days that followed were filled with the kind of healing that only time can bring. The cracks in their relationship, once so deep and jagged, began to heal over, slowly but surely. They learned to trust each other again, one small act at a time. One evening, as they stood together, watching the sunset, The groom took the bride's hand in his fingers curling gently around hers. "We've come a long way," he said quietly. "But we're not done yet." The bride looked at him, her smile soft and knowing. "We never will be," she said, her voice full of warmth. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe the journey is never really over." They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so uncertain. They didn't know what it held, but they knew they would face it together. The morning light broke through the thick clouds, casting a soft glow over the mansion. The air felt fresh, the scent of rain mingling with the earth, as if the world itself had been washed clean. The bride and groom stood in the garden, side by side, facing the future. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, anger, forgiveness, and growth. But now, in the quiet of the morning, there was only peace between them. The groom turned to the bride, his eyes filled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for so long: hope. "I never thought we'd get here," he said, his voice rough with the weight of everything they had been through. "But I'm glad we did." The bride smiled softly, her eyes shining with warmth. "So am I," she replied. "Maybe it was always meant to be this way. Maybe we had to fall apart before we could come back together." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers entwining with his. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Days turned into weeks, and the couple found themselves adjusting to a new rhythm. Their relationship had changed, but in some ways, it had become stronger. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when the past threatened to resurface, but they faced them together. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the living room, the groom spoke again, his voice soft. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his eyes looking into the flames. "But I know I want to face it with you, for better or worse." The bride looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "I feel the same way," she replied, her voice steady. "I don't need the future to be perfect. I just need us to keep trying." The fire crackled softly between them, a symbol of their shared warmth, of the bond they had rebuilt, piece by piece. For the first time in a long while, they both felt like they had found their way home. It was a quiet afternoon when the couple stood on the balcony together, watching the world below them. The garden stretched out before them, vibrant and full of life, and beyond that, the horizon was painted with the soft hues of an impending sunset. The groom wrapped his arm around the bride's waist, pulling her close. "I used to think everything was black and white," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But now I realize there are so many shades of gray. And maybe that's okay." The bride leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We don't need to have all the answers," she replied softly. "We just need to be here, together." The quiet, peaceful atmosphere around them mirrored the calmness they had finally found within themselves. For the first time, they truly understood that life wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance and growth. And in that moment, they knew that, together, they could face whatever the future had in store. Months passed, and the couple's bond grew deeper with each passing day. The secrets of the past had been laid bare, and though the scars would never fully fade, they had learned to live with them. The groom had come to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward in spite of it. One day, as they walked together through the garden, the bride paused and turned to him, her eyes full of something unspoken. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft, "about everything we've been through. And I realized something." The groom raised an eyebrow, curiosity lighting his features. "What's that?" he asked. The bride smiled faintly, her fingers brushing against his. "I realized that love isn't about perfection," she said quietly. "It's about the willingness to keep going, even when it's hard." The groom smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't agree more," he said, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. The years that followed were filled with moments of quiet joy and shared laughter. They built a life together, brick by brick, learning to love each other more deeply with every passing day. The past was no longer an anchor weighing them down, but a part of their journey, a journey that had led them here. One day, as they stood together on the same balcony where they had once watched the sunset, the groom turned to the bride, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We made it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The bride smiled, her eyes sparkling. "Yes," she replied. "We did." The sunset stretched before them, an endless horizon of possibilities. And for the first time in their lives, they truly believed that whatever came next, they could face it together.